Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. My name is David Lancefield, and I'm delighted to be here with the brilliant Deepa Purushothaman, the author, speaker, catalyst. You co-founded Information, a membership-based community for professional women of colour, offering a brave, safe new space for them and helping place them on C-suite and board positions, which is a fantastic endeavour. You've written a book called The First, The Few, The Only, How Women of Colour Redefine Power in Corporate America, published by HarperCollins, no less. And it's a powerful, substantive, shocking in a good way, and a challenging way, I have to say, having read it, and a story-filled book that is, I think, brilliant. I mean, it's a fantastic book. It's moved me, challenged me. When I look back at some of my own endeavours in the workplace, and I'm somebody who's married to a Kenyan Indian, I thought I was perhaps more, I don't know what the right term is, inclusive, progressive, but I don't think I have been. So I'm still in that zone, having read all of it in terms of, come on, David, how can I do better? You're coming in from LA today, as you can see, with all the beautiful sunshine. I'm coming from the UK, so clearly you can't see any. And you are most welcome, Deepa, most welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. And I have to say, it just clicked for me that you have a perfect radio voice. Like your voice is made for this.
Yeah. And as some people say, a face too. But let's not go into that. So we're going to talk about, obviously, how women of colour can, in your words, find, feel, and forge their power in the corporate world. And we may even touch a little bit on our experiences as former partners in rival consultancies.
Yes, yes.
So let's start with delusions. Why not? Let's start with delusions. A lot of people talk about empowering women of colour and actions fall short. There's a gap. There are many delusions. It's I think one of the strongest parts of your book. You capture a number of delusions that get in the way. Where would you start? Which delusions would you sort of challenge and call out the most?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with even explaining why I think the delusion concept is so important as a woman of color. And this is part of really what I wanted to do with the book, because when I was, traversing corporate America for the 2 decades that I did, there would often be experiences where I thought that's me. And part of my overall message and what I wanted to do in having women of color read the book is realize there are structural things happening to us around us that are also responsible for some of how we feel, and that we don't continue to take responsibility for discrimination, racism, things that don't, bounce in our favor, because not all of those are up to us. And so that's a little bit of the background of what the delusions are about. It's about painting the picture on why the system is broken. I mean, that's really what the book is about. It's in a way, I guess, a dialogue on capitalism and really
forgive me, but that's one of the most distinctive parts. So I'd say you call out the system rather than just saying it's up to the individual and so on. And of course, there's a large element of that, but you really call out the system strongly and rightly.
I do, because I feel like we've never had permission to talk about it. I think that's what's so amazing about this moment. And you said I'm in Los Angeles, so in America in particular, where there seems to be space for the first time to talk about the system, especially the corporate system, right? I'm not saying everyone's agreeing that it's broken, but I think people are realizing with COVID and everything else that's happening, there's more, breaks in it than ever before. And we're able to have that conversation. And so it's about permission to discuss that. As far as the actual delusions, I mean, I'll just pick one or two. I think one of them, and we already touched on it, is this idea that corporate America is a meritocracy and that the system shows up the same for you as it does for me. And I'm not saying it's always going to be positive for you and always going to be negative for me, but our experiences are different based on how we look and where we grew up and all the things that are outside of like our traditional work definitions. Yeah. And so that's part of, I think, a big delusion is we at least here, like to tell people, if you work hard, you will make it. And I'm part of my message is that only goes so far, and we have to be honest about that. So that's one big delusion that is clear and open for me. Another one, and I found this with so many of the women of color I met with, and I skewed a little bit more senior because I really wanted to hear from senior women who had been the first, the few, the only, and trailblazed and what their experiences were. They almost erroneously all the time felt like, I'll get to the seat. Like, I'm just going to get to the seat of power and then I'll do it my way. And so many of the women of color shared that once they got to the seat of power, they weren't able to do it their way. And in fact, it was actually harder at more senior levels because there was more of an expectation that they had done it a certain way, right? Or they played the game to get there, so now play it more. And so that was really saddening, disappointing, fascinating. That was a big delusion of, eventually I'll do it my way. There's no eventually, you have to do it now. And then the final is this idea of scarcity. And that's a big one for me. And we have a TED Talk coming out tomorrow that talks about this a little bit, but this idea that there's one seat, like so many women and women of color are taught, there's going to be one seat at the table for you. So inevitably we end up fighting with each other. And we also end up in a dialogue, David, you and I, we did similar work. So there's only going to be one seat. You and I are going to be fighting for it, right? And so this idea of scarcity and limitations, I think, doesn't help anybody. And so although my book is for women of color, what I'm really talking about is the system and the challenges and the constraints that we've put upon ourselves that don't really work for any of us. And that's really what the dialogue is. But those are some of the delusions that I find most interesting or most startling, I think, when people first pick up the book.
Yeah. I think you call out exactly the right ones, and there's more. So
there's more. There's 10. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean that last one, the sort of zero sum gain effect, was you gave an example of a colleague, a male colleague, who effectively, and I may not use the right language, thought, well, you're gonna, there's a place for you. You're gonna substitute for the white male, and that comes up a lot in conversation and dialogue and so on. And it's a very limiting. What's wrong, and it's a very limiting assumption, but it's implicit in the sort of either within your chatter of some of the white men and other people, and actually in conversation. I mean, I've heard it come up, right?
Absolutely. There was actually a report done by EY a few years ago. I want to say it was US based, but they surveyed or spoke with a number of white men, I want to say a few thousand. And the feedback was the white men felt that a lot of the inclusion work, their DE&I work, was actually hurting them because it was taking seats from them. And so it wasn't whether or not that was actually true. It was the sentiment, the feeling that something was taken from them. And so a lot of my book is about how do we reframe that? Because if it is this idea that we're taking from somebody to give to more women of color, that's not actually helpful. We're not trying to take anything. We're trying to say that there's actually other ways of doing business and other conversations to be had, and also other skills and unique things that we bring to the table that have not always been valued as we look at leadership or look at corporate America. And it's time we start to think about that differently.
It's a very empowering, motivating book, and a demanding one if you're a woman of color, because you really emphasize the inner work that's required to, I guess this comes back to finding yourself and knowing what you want to give. And I was really shocked by some of the stories where you talk about how women of color often have given too much with some of the consequences, including yourself. Tell me a bit more about the innate sort of power, the inner power that you need to succeed in the system that's so broken. Yeah.
So a lot of what I'm talking about and how I frame it is the power of me and the power of we. So, I talk about, and then there's obviously the structure. And so I talk about all three of those concepts in my book. And so some of it is the reprogramming or the indoctrination that we get as women of color. I mean, we're taught from an early age, we're not powerful. We don't see ourselves on television or in the media, or we're not leaders. And those kinds of messages can really affect us, can really, determine what we think is possible for ourselves. So a lot of what I'm talking about is decide very consciously about the messages that you've taken in from your parents or from school or from society, and decide for you what actually makes you feel powerful. Decide for you what works for you, and leave the rest. I call that process shedding and carrying, leaving the messages that don't work and carrying forward messages that do. I think the other part of that is also understanding that in order to have power, you have to really give yourself permission and really, decide what you're going to take on and what's not yours. Almost back to the previous answer is a lot of women of color take on responsibility for things that are not theirs, right? So there's a story in the book where a woman said she was the only Black woman in her company. And so she felt responsible for literally representing all Black people, not just, from that city or from that town, like for all Black people on the entire planet, because no one else, many of the people in her office had never met anyone else. And so that affected her hair, how she dressed, how she spoke, what she ate. I mean, she was so concerned about what the outward image was that she wasn't always able to focus on who she was and what she wanted and what was important to her. She was so focused on managing the image and the message. And so that is not something that I think we always often understand or talk about, all the extra jobs and all the extra things that women of color take on and navigate consciously or unconsciously. And so I'm asking women of color to be really conscious and be really thoughtful. And I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's very liberating and freeing once you do that work.
It takes a huge amount of energy to take on that load.
Yes.
And if you're especially in any type of role, but especially senior roles, then you have to perform, and in the system you're in, perform even better in many cases.
Yes.
I mean, that's a Herculean. I mean, that's a huge.
Yeah, no,
huge
it's a really clear one. That's actually probably the clearest example. So many of the women of color, again, because they were the first to fuse the onlys, had such responsibility for mentoring. Let's just take that example, right? Or
Yes.
sponsoring other women of color behind them. And some of the women would talk about 50, 60, people they were mentoring within their department or their company. Think about that. Think about how much time that is. I interviewed women who gave up their entire Friday afternoons on a weekly basis just to counsel and mentor. And think about that. Like, in the jobs that you and I had, a Friday afternoon is kind of when you're either getting rid of everything you haven't done for the week or just kind of starting to take care of yourself. And so they're giving that 4 or 5 hour block because there's no one else to do it.
Yes.
And we don't always credit that time. We don't always reward that time. We don't all pay them for that time. And yet we feel responsible because there's no one else to do it. And we want to help others, right? So I'm not saying we shouldn't help others, but there needs to be a recognition about how much extra we're doing as a result of the places we find ourselves and the rarity of us walking in certain spaces.
Let's flip it to a more positive thing.
Yes.
In the sense that we're going to talk about the hard bits and the good bits as well. I've worked with a number of male leaders, genuinely leaders, who I think are perhaps more open-minded than most. They've got a lot to learn, and having read this book, I still have a lot to learn too. But their short-term actions often around, well, we've got to build the pipeline. Got to build the pipeline of women of color and other groups that have been underrepresented and under-included. And they reach out to somebody like a talisman or woman figure or a headhunter, and they try and drive it. And then they realize it takes a long time, and they've got targets that have been set or they've set for themselves. If you are one of those individuals that's well-intentioned, that is not a woman of color, but recognizes the opportunity and recognizes the issue, where do you start?
It's a great question. I think there's a lot of different pieces of the work. So, you mentioned pipeline, so maybe I'll touch on that, but that's just one piece of this work, right? So one of the other delusions we didn't touch on is we'd like to say the pipeline that we couldn't find you. We couldn't find women of color. You don't exist. I can't tell you how many times a week I get told that, it's so hard to find you, none of you, there's only 5 of you that are board ready. Like that's not right. That's wrong. And part of this is that we also think recruiters are going to fix everything for us. And so we also have to understand that they're in an industry that is also trying to struggle through and trying to solve for all this. And so what I've found, at least in the pipeline conversation, is one, a lot of women of color aren't in those traditional recruiting lists or aren't working with some of the big companies. And so they're not on the list. When they're on the list, what we find is that recruiters tend to still, by default, because they're humans, go with the 20 to 30 people they know well and they talk to often, and they don't often happen to be the women of color. So if a CFO is calling for like a FP&A role, the recruiter just happens to remember, oh, Bob, Sam, Tom, which is at the top of his list because they've just had a conversation, or maybe they've, played golf together, maybe they're old college buddies. And so the woman of color just doesn't happen to be on the list. And so there's a multiple step process where it's getting on the list, it's being on the list, being remembered when you're on the list, and then also even the interview and even the vetting process. When we interview, we tend to, there's research in the book that supports this, we tend to default to people that we're comfortable with. And some of this conversation is hard, right? You and I are going to have some hard conversation, but it's necessary. And so I think part of what I tell leaders often is to give yourself permission. And so permission's a big theme for me, but give themselves permission that you're not going to get it right, that you're going to make mistakes, and that is part of this process. It's been centuries where we've not done this well, and we need to give ourselves permission, and also to be more cognizant in the moment. So that's where I think we need more activity. So if you see a microaggression or an incident of racism, don't make that the women of color's issue to solve for all the time. If you see something, say something, like the airport analogy, right? And that's up to you as well. It's up to all of us to change culture. But I think a lot of the time, allies, who I call co-conspirators, default to the woman of color and let her take responsibility for fixing the situation or speaking up because they don't always know what to do. If something doesn't feel right, there's a lot of messages in my body, in my book of, listen to your body. Like if it's telling you you're uncomfortable, like listen to that. I would say that to allies too. If you've just heard a comment that doesn't sit well with you, ask a question, say something like, I'm not sure I understood what you just said. Could you?
And it's not
that?
It's not a binary thing. I think some people step away from doing that, or step back from doing it, because there's a feeling of, if I say that, then this whole flurry of activity will happen, or they'll think I'm such and such. Life's not like that, right? I mean, it's not as simplistic. And I think you can frame your intervention, if you are a person hopefully of skill and thought, where you can say, that didn't sound right to me, or
Correct.
that wasn't right, that doesn't feel right to me. And at least it's about, as you say, dialogue, and frankly, permission to step forward and step in.
Yes.
Because one of the things I've taken a quote from your book, you say that we have to not just alter company culture, but shock company culture in new and uncomfortable ways. And, focusing on the moment is one thing, obviously taking a longer term approach to attraction of people. But what about in this sort of the big meetings and so on? So there are lots of, microaggressions in meetings, but not just board meetings, but meetings where people have to sort of try and, it's probably the one moment virtually or physically in a week or a fortnight where somebody can show how good they are, right, on a bigger stage. Anything particularly around, meetings or big events where people can change?
Yeah, I think it's being aware of who's speaking and how much space they take up, right? Part of this is, and I've spoken to a lot of women of color who actually find the virtual format actually more difficult, right? Because they find it harder to kind of jump in when there's a conversation going, or they find it just more challenging to speak up in this format. So that is actually a pretty common dialogue I've had. I think it's really paying attention to who's speaking. And so if someone hasn't said something, right? Deepa, you've kind of been quiet this meeting. Is there anything else you want to share? Or a lot of the women I work with have said they get talked over. So they'll repeat, they'll have an idea. Their idea is kind of dismissed, and 2 people later, their idea is repeated by someone, and it's the best idea. And there's a couple of stories in my book where I say, you're allowed to say, and that's very similar to my idea. I'm glad you thought that was a great one, right? Yeah, call it out. We just have to practice. Like women of color, we're not taught to call it out. We're taught to be grateful we're at the table. And part of my message is it's time for us to stop being grateful. You can be grateful if you want, but I want us to be grateful and say, there's other things we want in addition to, yes, I'm glad I'm here, but that also doesn't work for me. And it's okay for us to do that. I think we're just taught as women of color to not do those things. And to be fair, sometimes when we do, they don't work in our favor. But I think if more of us start doing them, more of us start calling out what's not working for us, it's the only way to make change. And unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult. And we just have to understand that as well.
When you talked about me and we, and there's a sort of the inner strength to do your inner work, to shed some of your assumptions, the things you've been taught or learned. And then there's the we in terms of building communities around you. And I'm fascinated because you need the community and network of people, whether it's allies or other women of color, and you need to do the inner work. Because I remember I think at the beginning of the book, you talk about the fact that, there weren't people to look up to role model from, which is a classic bit of advice you read in articles. Oh, find the role. Well, if there aren't any, what do you do?
Yes.
And so I'm just curious, if you are a woman of color and, you're in a high pressured environment, we're going through experiments of new working patterns as people go, at the time of this recording, going back into the office, not back to work, it's back into an office of some sort. Where do you start the process of, if you like, finding more of yourself? Because I think intuitively it makes sense. But if you've got demands, that you've got a lot of pressure, you've got no doubt commitments outside work as well, often those things can be a luxury. Sort of, well, I'll leave that to not just the Friday afternoon, but the weekend sort of activity. But this is central, finding yourself and finding a central activity to your success, right?
Absolutely. And I don't know that I knew that when I was in corporate America, because I say this in the book, like I didn't have time and I didn't have a lot of girlfriends and I didn't have these conversations. And so to be honest with you, I think often I struggled alone. And so part of my message is this is not networking, right? When I talk about the power of we, I'm not saying it's power of networking. It is about trauma. It is about processing racism. It is about, processing the system that we can't do by ourselves. There's an amazing quote where I interviewed this woman named Kanda. And she says, you need your sisters to actually make change in the world, right? You actually have to lean in and find each other, and that structural change takes all of us working together. And I think that's also my message, that the power of we is you can't change a structure by yourself. I can't change a structure by myself, but maybe if there's 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 of us in an organization, we can demand change and do things differently. So I think there are actions individuals can take, but I also think structural change of the type that I'm talking requires movement building. And that is the power of we. And so that's really what I'm talking about. And it's not something you have to do all the time, but it's women that you go to, that you can call when something bad happens and process what's happening. Because again, most of us suffer in pain. And I was just chatting this morning with somebody who was telling me about an incident. And I said to her, it's okay for you to talk about. It was a work related incident where someone had made a comment that made her feel uncomfortable. They asked her if she was the secretary when she walked in. She's a Black female lawyer. And she said, I didn't really know what to do. And I said, you probably felt shame and pain and confusion all in the same moment. And she said, how do you know? How did you know that? And that's the problem. In those moments, we don't know how to process. We don't know what to do. We're almost stunned. And so what I'm saying is having, even a chat on your phone with 3 other women of color, this just happened. Can you believe it? Allows you to feel and process. And some of what I did in my book was also talk to psychologists and therapists. And part of what you have to do is feel it, process it, and do almost the body work to let that sort of pain and shame go so you don't carry it with you. And so that's really what I'm talking about with the power of we. It's about witness. It's about really making change in that sort of way. It's not that sort of simple, I'm going to grab a drink because it's important to my career. That's not what I'm talking about. This is about survival. It's a different type of we, I think.
Yeah, this is very deep. I mean, this is deeply thoughtful. And in a way, what you're doing is identifying either in the moment or patterns of, activity or situations where it's likely you're going to be, sadly, in some of those situations. And it's learning how to respond, move forward, and frankly, teach, coach, learn, tell the others to stop it and to bring the best of yourself, and having people around you, either through the movement you are creating, have been creating. I mean, you're creating a movement, right? And you are, and it's a brilliant movement, clearly. And having groups of people around you who can say, "Hey, I get it. What did you do, and what works?" You're effectively stocking up your suite of strategies to actually work through those moments. I mean, one of the things you talk about your own personal story of overwork and very high performing sort of individual, and your own reflection on sort of what makes you happy, and focusing on what makes you happy, and actually what conditions can you work in that actually makes your body feel better and good. Tell me a little bit about your own story and what that told you for the book.
Absolutely. And so my own story is that I was at the height of my career, had sold the biggest project of my life. And, it was an M&A situation. So for those of you that are listening in that space, those are high burn projects. And so I was probably easily, and I'm not making up this number, working 100 hours a week. Had just gotten married. It was a very, very strange, stressful time. And I was in that situation for quite a long time, for a number of months. And it had started to take its toll on my body. I had started to ask different questions. I started having all these mysterious illnesses. And it took me almost 3 years to end up in, there's lots of mystery and thoughts around Lyme disease, but I ended up getting finally diagnosed with a Lyme disease diagnosis, but it took almost 15 doctors for me to get that diagnosis, partly because the symptoms kept changing, partly because they kept morphing. And there's a story in the book where I went to my 14th doctor and I said to her, something's not right. She ran all these tests and she basically said to me, I think your job is killing you. And what she meant by that is it's not letting you heal the situation. You travel, you work so much, you're not eating healthy, you're not doing anything to make yourself feel better. And yet your issues are manifesting. The reason that story is so important in the book is because almost every single woman of color I interviewed had some form of rash, stomach problem, headaches, fertility. I mean, they're listed in the book, but it's about a dozen symptoms. And they were all, struggling with this. And so my point is, I think the structure, not being seen and heard, having to really live up to some sort of image and some sort of way of working and way of success that's not defined by us, that was never defined by us, doesn't really work for us. And we don't talk about that. So much of the book is about redefining success. And I think in this moment, it's a theme that probably applies to most people, right? I think in a COVID world, we're probably all asking ourselves, what is the space we want work to take in our lives? And that is really the moment that I found myself in. I had lived to work, right? I was this high performing, high achieving, made partner in my early 30s, like that kind of personality. And although that was wonderful, it was really taking a toll on my body and my health. And I don't know that I had a balanced life. And I don't even know that I knew that that was a thing I should aspire for. And this is where I go back to the culture, right? I was raised by 2 Indian immigrants who came to this country and gave up everything. And so there was a hardcore message about success is really important, not because it's material and those sorts of things, but that because of the sacrifice, right? Yes. And I felt that responsibility. And so many of the women of color that I've interviewed feel that this weight of something that's bigger than material success. It's I'm responsible for everybody around me and under me and coming after me. And that's a really interesting weight.
It's really shocking. Well, I'm in a way, I'm pleased you're through it or going through it in a positive way. And it's really shocking. I was very shocked when I saw the list of ailments and problems and challenges, because you sort of get a sense that high performing people in general have, I touched on it in one of my HBR articles, some form of damage to themselves or others, often after the event. But I didn't realize it was so serious and so significant. That was shocking to me. And if you have to move from the sort of personal barometer, as I call it, to the sort of corporate barometer, how would you describe corporate life now in America as you see it? So in one word, how would you describe the picture?
Upheaval, maybe transitioning, like it's some word where I think it's being redefined. I think what we're hearing, especially from moms, right, not just women of color, but from moms in the US, is enough, that it's not doable. The structure doesn't support them, doesn't support, children, doesn't support wanting to leave work and, being able to transition between spheres. It doesn't allow for that. Everything is kind of mixed together. And so I think we're in a moment, again, I'm talking about women of color, but the themes I'm talking about are relevant to so many different communities, because I also don't think work is working for white men. Let's be clear, like, especially the ones of my generation and younger, you all don't want to work that much and give up everything as well, but you're not even allowed to talk about that. So it's this, I don't think it's working for anyone is part of the message. But to your point, I think my message is also really positive that it can, but we have to be willing to change some of the things that we prize. Like one of the things I was so surprised about, both for myself and the women of color I met, was that this idea of produce, conform, right? Do more was such a mantra of how they lived their life, because it was all about continuing to do well and perfectionism, because they were taught that early on. They had to be twice as good or 4 times as good. They had to not mess up because there was no room for them to mess up as an only. And so I just think it's that cycle, right? Those are the messages we need to redo. I think we all need to renew, not just women of color.
And in a beautiful way, you are creating this space, not just through your foundation, but through this book as well, for people to craft their own lives and craft their own roles, having done the sheddings, understood the delusions, and worked out the sort of archetype they were playing. You have archetypes in the book, and a number of archetypes they were probably playing in some way, but not always realizing it. Exactly. And so going through that process, and then you have it's not just a manifesto for change, which it is, but you have a series of playbooks in the book setting out, effectively how you can learn, earn, and return. What actions would you particularly call out? There's a lot to cover there. And all we're doing here is giving tasters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go and read the book, of course.
Yes, of course they do. And I was going to say, a lot of the concepts in the book are difficult to talk about. They're not easy conversations, right? They're not checklist sort of items. So there is deep work there and deep thought in the book. And I don't think it's a one time you read it and you're done sort of book. That's not what I was looking for. I know it's hard and complicated. The chapter you're talking about is the chapter around how do you play the game, while you're trying to change the game. And it's an interesting chapter, because it's not a chapter I wanted to write. And I say this in the book, like I really did not want to talk about playing the game, because I feel like that's what we teach people to do, and especially women of color. But I got really far into my interview process, and I interviewed 500 women of color to write the book. And I got deep in, and it kept coming up. Like, you need to tell younger women what to do and what not to do, so they don't waste their time. Like, you need to write the book that we never had. And so this woman sat me down and she said, part of what we need to do is change the game while we're playing the game. And in those sorts of messages, I had this aha of like, yes, we need to do it differently. And so I just did a piece with a few professors for HBR around negotiation. And I think I'll take that example. I interviewed a recruiter in the book, and she said to me that women of color don't often ask for their worth. So when someone says to you, what salary do you expect? In America, they've changed some of the policies, so you're not allowed to ask for your previous salary. And so a lot of the women of color this recruiter meets go in thinking, well, they're not going to be asked that. So, they're safe. They don't have to have an answer around that. So they aren't prepared for when they still get asked that question in a roundabout fashion. And so her point is, ask for 2 or 3 times what you want, because if you don't, you won't get it. And to know your worth and to do the research and to be comfortable. And she literally lays out that she works with white male leaders, and they will ask for 2x or 3x of their previous salary, knowing they won't get it. but feeling no shame or no constraint in asking for that. And what is happening to us that we're afraid to even ask for a little bit more than what we had before? And so there's strategies like that. Again, it's less do this and more, this is what happened. So what are you going to do about it? That's really what the book is about. Yeah. So that's an example that I really like, because I think we need to ask for what we want, and we're not taught that,
It's about belief.
Yes.
It's about and self-worth and courage to have that conversation. What biggest change have you noticed in yourself since moving on from your previous role?
Let me know, you touched on it with the health topics. A lot of what I ended up doing. So I ended up getting really sick to the point that I had pins and needles in my hands and feet. I had headaches every day. I mean, I spent probably 8 months in bed without a clear diagnosis of what was happening. And so that time really gave me time to reflect on what was important to me and who I wanted to be. Lyme disease is also a very strange disease in that there's not one sort of treatment for it. So it's a very, some people don't even consider it real, right? Like that's a whole different conversation. So I traveled the globe working with healers and trying to find something that worked for me. And that led me to many different conversations on what spirituality is and what truth is and what liberation is. And so it was not the path I was trying to go on, but I think where I've landed is who I am and how I show up matter more to me, and finding my voice in the process has been really important, and where my work has taken me. I think when you're in corporate, I don't know if you felt this way. I thought I had my voice, but now being out of corporate, it's a completely different voice, because you're still very constrained in what you can say and what you believe when you're in corporate. But I don't know that I knew that. And I think that's part of why I got sick, to be honest with you. I think I wasn't in my full voice, probably doing what I should have been doing in the world. And it was the universe, telling me I needed to do something else. And so there's a flavor of that in the book. So I've gotten a little bit more spiritual or philosophical, I think, through this process. And meeting these women has also taught me that so much of what I thought was me and deficiency in me is not a deficiency in me. I was taught that, and I can choose to rewrite that and find different power.
It's a very strategic book, and it's a very strategic movement, because it's about choice.
Yes.
And it's about, working out where you can play.
Yes.
And how you can win in your own way of winning.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly what it is. There's a woman who described it as agency. And my favorite book is my favorite chapter is the last chapter. And, I wanted to touch on it because I don't think this was the book to write this write an entire book about it. But I talk about power. I mean, part of what I want us to do is really start to think about the definition of power differently. I don't know if you felt this way, but I've read all the books on power that we're taught to read, right? And a lot of them are written in this sort of dog eat dog, like, competition, aggressive, very, candid, masculine sort of way of seeing the world. And part of what I think I'm saying is that kind of power, that kind of aspiration doesn't really work for me. And so what is one that does? And that is where we can find real power. And that is where we can rewrite the system and rewrite capitalism and rewrite other things, because maybe some of the things we've inherited don't work anymore. And I think the last few years have shown us that they're hemorrhaging and they don't work for anybody. So that's really, I think, where I wanted to go with this, and where I think my future work will go. But it's very much about new definitions, so that more of us feel empowered and more of us can make change, and we can make the world work for more of us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I agree with that. Yeah. So in a nutshell, as my final question, what impact do you want to have?
It's a great question, because I'm in this moment where, we're having the conversation prior to the book launch. And there's a lot of discussion around what's important. Is making a list important? Is selling a bunch of books important? Is, getting on certain podcasts important? And I've really struggled with that, because I'm finding myself, even though having departed corporate, looking at metrics that are corporate, that are traditional, and wanting to live a different life and wanting to see success differently. Yet everything in this new model is about how many books you sell and where it gets sold and who says it's a great book. And so it's taken me a little while, but I think really for me, success is women of color, and I want allies and co-conspirators to read it, but I wrote it for women of color. There's not enough books written for us. I read a stat that said only 11% of books are written by women of color. And so it's a very small number. And so in traditional publishing, I should say. And so I want women of color to see themselves and to feel freed, and for them to feel like, wow, I see myself in this book, and I'm going to do something differently as a result. And that's how I'm going to see success. But it's a process. And I share that to say, I think it's always a process. Even if when you leave certain structures, there's other structures that exist that you're going to find the same questions coming up in. And so, I'm not done just because I've exited corporate. I have the same questions come up in all aspects of my life. And it's about rewriting and continuing to rewrite those messages.
I mean, for sure, the world around you and the wider world, women of colour in particular, is going to be better, brighter, bolder for what you do and what you stand for and what you've written. So I applaud you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your support and your thoughtful questions.
Pleasure. Hey, this has been a rich, important, substantive conversation, moving, as especially somebody who's a white male, going back over history and replaying some moments, but also thinking now it's up to me in terms of how I interact. Although I'm not in corporate, I deal with still quite a few corporate people, and I do have an influence in a different way in terms of the agenda of leaders and how do I now use it. So that's my homework amongst other things to take away. Where can the world find out more about you and all your work?
Yes, if you can go to my website. So it's deepapuru.com, and information about the book and speaking and even information is there, and all the things that we've kind of touched on today.
This is going to be
I was going to say, there's also resources there. So as an ally, if you want, a cheat sheet on 5 things you can do, there are resources like that as well.
Yeah, it's a treasure trove. I commend it, and I'll share all the links and so on in this. Hey, this was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. If you did enjoy this conversation, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and to my podcast, and do check out the other interviews in the series. Deepa, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone for listening.